Picture this. You're driving down a dusty Baltimore road in the mid-1990s, stomach rumbling, when you spot a humble roadside barbecue stand. The smell of charred meat wafts through your car window, and you think to yourself, perfect, just what I need. You pull over, order a sandwich, take that first satisfying bite, and compliment the vendor on his unique seasoning. Little did you know, you might have just become an unwitting participant in one of America's most disturbing culinary experiments. Meet Joe Metheny, a man whose recipe for success involved ingredients that would make Gordon Ramsay reach for something considerably stronger than his usual expletives. This is the tale of how a 500-pound drifter from Baltimore turned his homicidal tendencies into what he claimed was a thriving roadside food business. And before you ask, yes, this story is about to get considerably more unappetizing than your average cooking show. Now, I should mention that while Joe's claims about his barbecue enterprise were never definitively proven in court, his confessions paint a picture so bizarre that reality TV producers are probably still kicking themselves for missing out on the most twisted Food Network special ever conceived. Joseph Roy Metheny didn't exactly start life with a silver spoon in his mouth, though given what he'd later do with cutlery, perhaps that's for the best. Born in 1955 in Baltimore, Joe's childhood reads like a textbook example of how not to raise a functioning member of society. His father abandoned the family when Joe was young, leaving his mother to work multiple jobs just to keep food on the table. As a child, Joe was reportedly the victim of severe abuse and neglect. By the time he reached adolescence, he'd already developed what psychiatrists would later describe as concerning behavioral patterns, which is professional speak for, this kid pulls wings off flies and enjoys it a bit too much. Joe's teenage years were spent bouncing between foster homes and juvenile facilities, racking up an impressive collection of petty crimes and violent outbursts. He was the sort of student who made teachers consider career changes, and the kind of neighbor who made people double-check their door locks at night. But here's where Joe's story takes its first peculiar twist. Despite his troubled youth, he managed to land a job as a forklift operator at a pallet company. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed like Joe Metheny might actually turn his life around. He even found love, or at least his version of it, with a woman who bore him a son. Unfortunately, domestic bliss wasn't exactly Joe's forte. His girlfriend, apparently possessed of considerably more survival instincts than romantic inclinations, eventually decided that living with a 500-pound man with anger management issues wasn't the fairy tale she'd signed up for. She took their son and disappeared into the night, leaving Joe with nothing but an empty house and a rapidly growing list of grievances against the world. Now, most people might respond to such a setback by perhaps seeking therapy, joining a support group, or at the very least drowning their sorrows in ice cream like normal human beings. Joe, however, had a rather more creative approach to dealing with abandonment issues. He became convinced that his ex-girlfriend was living somewhere under the Hanover Street Bridge in Baltimore, among the homeless community that had set up camp in the area. Armed with nothing but rage and a disturbing lack of social boundaries, Joe began what he called his search mission. This is where our story takes a sharp left turn into territory that even the most imaginative horror writers might find a bit extreme. Joe didn't just go looking for his ex-girlfriend. He went hunting. And when I say hunting, I mean that in the most literal, predatory sense of the word. His first victim was a homeless man who had the misfortune of crossing paths with Joe during one of these search missions. The details of what happened next are too graphic for polite company. But let's just say that Joe's method of interrogation would have made medieval inquisitors uncomfortable. When the homeless man couldn't provide information about Joe's ex-girlfriend, which, let's be honest, was probably because he genuinely didn't know anything, Joe's response was swift and permanent. The man became the first entry in what would become a very short but very disturbing guest list to Joe's impromptu outdoor dinner parties. Now, here's where things get properly weird, and by weird, I mean the sort of weird that makes you question humanity's place in the evolutionary chain. Most killers, even the particularly unhinged ones, tend to dispose of their victims in relatively conventional ways. Burial, dismemberment, acid baths, that sort of thing. Joe, however, had watched one too many cooking shows and had developed some rather unconventional ideas about waste management. According to Joe's later confessions, After killing his first victim, he did something that would make even seasoned forensic investigators reach for the antacids. He cooked parts of the body and ate them. Not because he was starving, mind you, but because he was curious about the taste. And Joe's review? Well, let's just say he gave human flesh 2 thumbs up and started planning his next meal. This wasn't a one-time experiment born of desperation or mental breakdown. Joe had discovered what he considered a new culinary frontier, and like any enthusiastic foodie, he was eager to expand his palate. Over the following months, Joe continued his searches under the Hanover Street Bridge, and each time he encountered someone who couldn't help him find his ex-girlfriend, they ended up contributing to his increasingly exotic diet. But Joe wasn't content to keep his culinary discoveries to himself. After all, what's the point of developing a signature dish if you can't share it with others? This is where Joe's story transforms from merely disturbing to absolutely mind-bending. Sometime in the mid-1990s, Joe decided to combine his newfound dietary preferences with his entrepreneurial spirit. He set up a modest roadside barbecue stand along a busy Baltimore thoroughfare, complete with a grill, some folding chairs, and what he claimed was his secret blend of meats. Joe's business model was elegantly simple. Kill homeless people, butcher the bodies, mix the human remains with pork and beef from legitimate sources, then serve the resulting concoction to unsuspecting customers as barbecue sandwiches. It was like a food truck, except with considerably more sinister ingredients and a target demographic that had no idea they were participating in an impromptu anthropological experiment. According to Joe's confessions, his roadside stand was surprisingly popular. Customers praised his unique flavor combinations and asked about his secret ingredients. Joe, ever the businessman, was happy to engage in small talk about his cooking methods while carefully omitting certain key details about his supply chain. The truly chilling part? Joe claimed that no one ever complained about the taste. In fact, he boasted that customers often came back for seconds, praising the distinctive flavor of his special blend barbecue. Whether this was true or simply the product of Joe's increasingly detached relationship with reality is something we'll thankfully never know for certain. But if you think Joe's story couldn't get any more bizarre, well, you clearly haven't been paying attention to the pattern here. Joe's roadside culinary empire might have continued indefinitely if not for one small problem. He was getting increasingly sloppy with his victim selection. While homeless individuals often go missing without much fanfare from the authorities, Joe's appetite was beginning to outpace his ability to fly under the radar. It started with a series of missing person reports around the Hanover Street Bridge area. Social workers noticed that several of their regular clients had simply vanished. While homeless individuals do sometimes disappear, they move to other cities, get arrested, or sadly, succumb to the harsh realities of street life. The pattern was becoming too consistent to ignore. Local police began investigating, and they quickly identified Joe as a person of interest. It wasn't particularly difficult detective work, mind you. When you're a 500-pound man with a history of violence who's been seen arguing with multiple people who subsequently vanish, you tend to stand out in witness statements. The investigation hit pay dirt when authorities discovered that Joe had been bragging about his exploits to anyone who would listen. Apparently, Joe had developed something of a god complex and was eager to share his achievements with the world. He'd been telling people at local bars about his innovative cooking methods, though most listeners assumed he was either joking or completely delusional. Unfortunately for Joe, one of these listeners happened to be an undercover police officer who recognized the details from the missing person cases. The officer managed to record several of Joe's confessions, creating a disturbing audio library of culinary crimes that would make even the most hardened investigators lose their appetites. When the police finally arrested Joe in 1996, they were expecting to deal with a standard serial killer case. What they got instead was something that belonged more in a Stephen King novel than a police procedural. Joe didn't just confess to killing people, he provided detailed recipes. He explained his butchering techniques with the enthusiasm of a Food Network host, describing how he mixed human remains with conventional meat to create what he called the perfect blend. He talked about seasoning choices, cooking times, and customer feedback with the same passion that Julia Child might have discussed her coq au vin. The recordings of these confessions are, by all accounts, absolutely chilling. Joe spoke about his victims not as human beings, but as ingredients. He discussed their various qualities: which ones were too tough, which ones had the best flavor, which ones required longer cooking times. It was as if he'd completely divorced himself from the reality of what he was doing and had retreated into some sort of twisted culinary fantasy. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Joe's confessions was his pride in his customer service. He genuinely seemed to believe that he'd been providing a valuable service to the community, offering affordable, high-quality barbecue to working-class Baltimore residents. The fact that his secret ingredient happened to be his murder victims was, in Joe's mind, simply a clever bit of cost-cutting and waste reduction. Joe claimed to have killed at least 10 people, though investigators suspected the actual number might have been higher. He provided detailed descriptions of his methods, his disposal techniques, and his cooking processes. It was like getting a master class in applied psychopathy, narrated by someone who seemed genuinely confused about why everyone was making such a big fuss. Joe's trial began in 1997, and it quickly became the sort of media circus that usually only happens when celebrities are involved. The press dubbed him the Cannibal Killer, though Joe himself preferred the Roadside Chef, a distinction that probably tells you everything you need to know about his mental state. The prosecution's case was relatively straightforward. Joe Metheny had killed multiple people and fed them to unsuspecting customers. The defense, meanwhile, had the unenviable task of explaining why their client had confessed to crimes that sounded like they'd been dreamed up by a particularly disturbed horror novelist. Joe's defense team attempted to argue that their client was mentally incompetent and that his confessions were the product of severe psychological illness. They brought in psychiatrists who testified about Joe's traumatic childhood, his history of abuse, and his obvious disconnection from reality. The prosecution, however, had those pesky confession tapes, hour upon hour of Joe calmly and methodically describing his crimes, his techniques, and his business model. It was hard to argue incompetence when the defendant had been running what amounted to a cannibalistic food service operation for months. Joe himself was surprisingly cooperative during the trial. He seemed genuinely puzzled by all the attention and maintained that he'd simply been trying to make an honest living while dealing with his personal problems in a creative way. When asked about the morality of feeding human remains to unsuspecting customers, Joe responded that people seemed to enjoy the food, so where was the harm? It was this casual attitude toward his crimes that probably sealed Joe's fate more than any physical evidence could have. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with their verdict: guilty on all counts. Joe was sentenced to death, though he would later have his sentence commuted to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Throughout the sentencing phase, Joe maintained his bizarre detachment from the gravity of his crimes. When the judge asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, Joe reportedly asked if he could get the recipe for the prison cafeteria's barbecue sauce, claiming it wasn't as good as his own. Health officials estimated that potentially hundreds of customers had visited Joe's roadside stand during his months of operation. Joe's victims were eventually identified through dental records and other forensic evidence. Joe spent the remainder of his life in prison, where he became something of a celebrity among both inmates and true crime enthusiasts. He would discuss his crimes with the same casual attitude that most people reserve for talking about the weather. Joe's fellow inmates, despite being criminals themselves, reportedly found him deeply unsettling. In his later years, Joe began writing what he called his cookbook, a disturbing collection of recipes. Joe Metheny died in prison in 2017, taking many of his secrets with him. The most disturbing question that Joe's case raises is one that may never be fully answered. How many people unknowingly participated in his gruesome culinary experiments? What we do know is that Joe Metheny represented something genuinely unique in the annals of criminal history. The case also highlighted serious gaps in how society deals with its most vulnerable members. Joe's victims were primarily homeless individuals whose disappearances initially attracted little attention from authorities. It was only when the pattern became too obvious to ignore that anyone began asking questions about what had happened to them. So there you have it, the story of Joe Metheny, the roadside barbecue entrepreneur who took the concept of secret ingredients to places that even the most imaginative food critics never dreamed of exploring. It's a tale that combines elements of horror, dark comedy, and genuine human tragedy. in ways that would make even the most seasoned true crime writers reach for something considerably stronger than coffee. Joe's legacy, if we can call it that, serves as a reminder that sometimes reality is far stranger and more disturbing than anything fiction could devise. But don't worry too much. The odds of encountering another Joe Metheny are thankfully astronomical. After all, there's only room for one Cannibal Chef in the history books, and Joe has that particular niche market thoroughly cornered. Former customers of his roadside stand are still wondering what made those barbecue sandwiches taste so uniquely memorable. And on that thoroughly appetite-destroying note, perhaps it's time to stick to chain restaurants for a while.